Before we go further, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear is moving fast, and you don't want to miss the next chapter of this story. Now let's get into it. For months, the world has been watching a strip of water on the map that most people couldn't have pointed to a year ago. The Strait of Hormuz. It's barely 20 miles wide at its narrowest point, but through that narrow channel flows a huge slice of the planet's oil supply, day after day, tanker after tanker. Whoever controls that strait doesn't just control shipping lanes, they control leverage over the entire global economy. Since the end of February 2026, the United States and Israel have been at war with Iran. It didn't start as a naval story. It started with airstrikes, missile exchanges, and a region already stretched thin from years of tension. But somewhere along the way, the story shifted. Iran realized that if it couldn't win in the air, it could still hurt the world in the water. So it did what regimes under pressure often do. It reached for its oldest threat. It moved to choke the strait. For weeks, Iran's Revolutionary Guard tried to control who could pass and who couldn't. Ships were harassed. Tankers were attacked. Some were hit directly, their crews injured, their cargo set ablaze in the water. Insurance costs for shipping companies exploded. Oil markets shivered every time a new headline broke. And through it all, Iran kept insisting the strait was its own property, its own toll road, its own weapon to hold over the world. Then, in April, the United States decided it had seen enough. President Trump ordered a naval blockade, not of the strait itself, but of Iran's own ports. The distinction matters more than people realize. The Americans weren't closing the water to everyone. They were closing it specifically to Iran. Every other nation's ships could move freely. Only vessels tied to Iranian ports were stopped, boarded, and in some cases seized. It's almost poetic if you think about it. Iran spent decades building its entire strategy around the idea that it could hold the world's oil supply hostage by threatening to shut the strait. And now, the United States has essentially said, fine, let's talk about shutting things down, except we're only going to shut down your side of it. By the start of May, the numbers told the story better than any speech could. American forces reported dozens of vessels intercepted, several ships seized outright. Independent shipping trackers estimated that dozens more tried to slip past the blockade using flag tricks and course changes, but the pressure was clearly working. The Pentagon's own estimate put Iran's lost oil revenue at close to $5 billion in just a matter of weeks. President Trump claimed the cost to Iran was running near $500 million a day. Whether you take the higher number or the more conservative one, the direction is the same. Iran's income was drying up in real time. For a while, there was hope this would end differently. In April, both sides reached a fragile ceasefire. Talks began. There was even a moment, a signing at a grand European palace where it looked like the war might actually be winding down. The blockade paused. Ships moved again. Oil markets breathed. But peace built on unresolved anger rarely lasts. Iran began charging its own tolls on ships passing through waters it claimed to control, sometimes over $1 million per vessel. Attacks on commercial ships resumed, and by the second week of July, the fragile truce collapsed completely. Iran struck tankers in the strait. One crew member was killed. The United States responded with a fresh wave of airstrikes, hitting targets across multiple Iranian provinces. And the blockade came roaring back, this time framed even more directly. The White House began describing America's role not just as an enforcer, but, as in the president's words, the guardian of the strait itself. For a brief and strange moment, there was even talk of charging a 20% fee on all cargo passing through the strait, a kind of American toll booth to match Iran's toll booth. That idea didn't survive long. It was walked back within days, replaced instead with promises of trade and investment deals with Gulf nations. But the message underneath the walking back was clear. The United States wasn't just fighting a war anymore. It was rewriting who gets to profit from one of the most valuable choke points on Earth. If you're starting to see how deep this rabbit hole goes, make sure you're subscribed because we're only getting started. And the next part of this story explains exactly why cutting off a country's ports can be more devastating than any missile strike. To understand why a blockade matters so much, you have to understand how the Iranian regime actually stays in power. It isn't really about ideology at the top. It's about money moving through very specific channels. Oil gets sold, mostly to buyers willing to work around sanctions. That money flows back into the government. And a huge portion of that money goes toward paying and equipping the Revolutionary Guard, the organization that keeps the regime standing. This is the part people miss when they only watch the missile strikes and ignore the economics. The Revolutionary Guard isn't loyal to the regime out of pure belief. It's loyal because the regime pays it, arms it, and gives its commanders comfortable lives while the rest of the country struggles. Cut the money, and you start to strain that loyalty. Strain that loyalty, and you start to strain the entire foundation the regime stands on. That's exactly what a naval blockade targets. Not soldiers directly, not missile sites directly. Money. Oil that can't leave port can't be sold. Oil that can't be sold generates no revenue. No revenue means less cash for the very organization the regime depends on to keep itself in power. It's a slow squeeze, but it's a real one, and every day it continues, the pressure builds a little more. This is why the blockade has been described by American officials less as a military maneuver and more as an economic one, even though it's carried out entirely by military force. Aircraft carriers, guided missile destroyers equipped with advanced radar and defense systems, submarines running silently beneath the surface, essentially invisible to anything Iran has left to detect them with, patrol aircraft circling overhead, fast boats ready to board and inspect any vessel trying to sneak through. It's an enormous amount of firepower being used for something that sounds almost mundane, checking paperwork, verifying cargo, turning ships around. But that's the point. This isn't about winning a naval battle. Iran's navy, after weeks of sustained strikes, has been degraded to a fraction of what it once was. This is about controlling economic access, and doing it so thoroughly that there's no realistic way around it. Iran's response has followed a pattern that's become almost predictable at this point. Angry statements, claims that the blockade is illegal, warnings that no port in the region is safe. State media running dramatic footage meant to project strength. But if you look closely at what's actually happening on the water, the gap between the rhetoric and the reality keeps growing wider. Take the mines, for example. Iran spent weeks planning sea mines near the Strait's northern approaches, an attempt to make the waterway dangerous for American and Allied ships. But the effect of those mines has, in a strange twist, worked against Iran's own interests. Commercial shipping was forced further south, away from the minefields, and further from Iranian coastal positions. That southern route happens to be exactly where American ships can operate most freely, and where Iranian harassment capability is weakest. Iran built a trap, and traffic simply walked around it, right into the zone where enforcement is strongest. Something similar has happened with drone attacks. Iran's Shahed drones have been one of its most repeated weapons throughout this war. Cheap, plentiful, and easy to launch from scattered locations. But these same drones fly low and slow, which makes them exactly the kind of target that modern close-in defense systems on American ships are built to shoot down. Report after report shows these drones being intercepted before they get anywhere near their targets. It doesn't mean every single one fails. But the success rate Iran needs to actually change the strategic picture simply hasn't materialized. Even Iran's propaganda tells its own story if you read between the lines. State media released an animated video showing an American aircraft carrier flipping over and sinking. On the surface, that's meant to look like strength. But think about who that video is actually for. American military planners aren't shaping their strategy based on a cartoon. That video wasn't made for Washington. It was made for the Iranian people, a population living through blackouts, medicine shortages, and a war that's dragged on for months with no clear end. It's a message meant to convince a tired, struggling public that the regime is still winning, even as the evidence on the ground says otherwise. The more dramatic the propaganda gets, the more it tends to reveal the opposite of what it's trying to prove. We're already deep into this story, but there's a lot more worth knowing before you go anywhere. So if this video has been useful so far, do me a favor and share it with someone who's been trying to understand what's actually happening in the Gulf right now, because most coverage skips straight past the details that actually matter. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting, because Iran didn't just wake up to this vulnerability. It planned for it years in advance. And that plan tells you everything about how seriously Iranian strategists have always taken the risk of exactly this scenario. For years, Iran has been investing in a pipeline project designed to move oil from its interior fields to ports on its southern coast, specifically built to bypass the strait entirely. The logic behind it is simple. If your entire export system depends on one narrow, chokeable waterway, and your enemy has the world's most powerful navy, then eventually that waterway becomes your biggest weakness instead of your biggest advantage. The pipeline was Iran's long-term answer to a blockade before a blockade even happened. But here's the catch. A pipeline still has to end somewhere. Oil still needs a port to load onto tankers. And the language used to describe the current blockade specifically covers all Iranian ports on the Arabian Gulf and Gulf of Oman, not just the strait itself. If the pipeline's southern terminus connects to a port inside that blockade zone, the entire purpose of the pipeline collapses. You can build a bypass all you want, but if the exit point is still blocked, you've just built a very expensive dead end. It raises a genuinely fascinating question. Did American military planners specifically design the blockade's scope with this pipeline in mind? We can't know that for certain from the outside, but the timing and the wording certainly suggest that whoever built this strategy understood exactly what Iran's fallback plan looked like and made sure to close that door too. None of this happened in a vacuum either. Before the blockade returned in July, there were direct negotiations happening between American and Iranian representatives. Vice President Vance was among those pushing to keep the diplomatic door open, arguing that the kind of asymmetric threats Iran can pose in the Strait mean a lasting resolution really has to come through negotiation, not bombing alone. But those talks kept running into the same wall. The core disagreement wasn't really about tolls or shipping lanes, it was about Iran's nuclear program. The United States wanted it gone. Iran treated any demand to dismantle it as an unacceptable humiliation, a line it refused to cross regardless of the military and economic cost of refusing. That gap never closed. And every time diplomacy failed to bridge it, the war resumed exactly where it left off, sometimes worse than before. Meanwhile, the technology behind this blockade deserves its own moment of attention, because it's easy to talk about ships and forget just how connected modern naval warfare actually is. American destroyers in the region use an integrated radar and defense network that shares information across every ship in real time. If one vessel detects an incoming drone or missile, that information isn't just useful to that one ship, it's instantly shared across the entire formation, allowing multiple ships to respond together before the threat even gets close. Submarines contribute their own picture of the underwater environment without ever needing to surface or reveal their position. Aircraft overhead extend the surveillance net even further, well beyond what any single ship's radar could see on its own. What this means in practical terms is that Iran isn't just facing a handful of powerful warships. It's facing an entire connected system that behaves almost like a single organism, sensing, sharing, and reacting together. The kind of small boat swarm tactics that Iran has used in the past, overwhelming a single ship from multiple directions at once, were designed to beat an older kind of naval defense. They weren't designed to beat a networked system, where every platform contributes to defending every other platform simultaneously. This is part of why, despite months of fighting, Iran hasn't been able to meaningfully challenge the blockade at sea. It isn't a lack of aggression, it's a mismatch in capability that keeps getting more obvious the longer this drags on. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about understanding this conflict properly, not just skimming headlines. So do me one favor, drop a comment with what part of this story surprised you the most. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who are trying to make sense of what's happening right now. So where does this actually go from here? That's the question everyone, from oil traders to world leaders, is quietly asking. There are really only a handful of paths available to the Iranian regime, and none of them look easy. One option is to try to physically challenge the blockade, using whatever naval capability remains, but this has already been tried in different forms throughout the war, and the outcome has been consistent. Vessels that attempt direct confrontation with modern destroyers backed by air cover and submarine support don't win those encounters. It isn't a matter of bravery, it's a matter of technology gaps that bravery alone can't close. Yet military logic and political logic don't always agree. Hardliners inside Iran's power structure, the ones who see any restraint as weakness, may continue pushing for exactly this kind of confrontation, even when the numbers say it's a losing move. Another option is to escalate strikes against neighboring Gulf countries, the kind of threat Iranian officials have floated more than once, but this path carries enormous risk for Iran itself. Countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain aren't neutral bystanders anymore. Some have already contributed aircraft to operations against Iranian targets. Their economies depend heavily on the very ports and shipping lanes Iran would be threatening. Attacking them risks turning a two-country war into a coordinated regional response, backed by American support, aimed squarely at a regime already stretched thin on multiple fronts. The third option, and arguably the most rational one, is to simply absorb the economic pain of the blockade, while trying, once again, to find a diplomatic off-ramp. This is clearly the path some voices within Iran's own government have quietly pushed for. But absorbing that pain isn't free either. Every week the blockade continues, oil revenue keeps draining. Every dollar that doesn't reach government coffers is a dollar that can't be used to maintain the loyalty systems that keep the regime's internal structure intact. It's a slow bleed, but a real one. And slow bleeds have a way of eventually forcing decisions that quick shocks never could. What makes this moment different from previous flashpoints in the broader Middle East conflict isn't the intensity of any single strike or any single week of fighting. Tease the method. Blockades aren't dramatic in the way missile strikes are. There's no explosion to show on the news every night. But economically, they're often more effective because they don't just damage infrastructure. They damage the ability of a regime to fund itself, to pay the people who keep it in power, and to maintain the appearance of stability to its own population. There's also a broader diplomatic backdrop worth mentioning. Global voices, including religious and humanitarian leaders, have called for peace throughout this conflict, urging all sides to find a better path than continued warfare. That call for peace is sincere, and it reflects a genuine concern for the human cost of this war on ordinary people caught in the middle of it, people who didn't choose this conflict and are the ones actually living through blackouts, shortages, and fear. Whatever side of this debate you land on, that human cost deserves to be taken seriously, and it's easy to lose sight of it when the conversation gets dominated by ships, radar systems, and strategic maps. At the same time, American officials argue that the blockade itself is meant to shorten this war, not prolong it, by targeting the regime's financial lifeline rather than its cities or civilian population directly. Whether that argument holds up depends heavily on how long the standoff actually lasts, and how the regime chooses to respond to mounting pressure it clearly wasn't fully prepared for. Before we get to where this leaves us, if you've been enjoying this breakdown, tap that like button right now. It's a small action, but it tells this platform to put this video in front of more people who are genuinely trying to understand what's unfolding in the Gulf instead of just scrolling past another headline. Here's the part of this story that's easy to miss if you only follow the daily headlines. Wars are usually judged by their loudest moments, the missile strikes, the burning tankers, the dramatic footage. But this blockade represents something quieter and, in some ways, more decisive. It's a slow-motion pressure campaign, built not to destroy Iran's military outright, but to hollow out the financial system that keeps its most powerful institution loyal to the people currently in charge. Iran spent decades treating the Strait of Hormuz as its ultimate bargaining chip, the one card it could always play if pushed into a corner. Threaten to close it, and the world pays attention. Threaten to close it, and oil prices jump, and suddenly a regional power has global leverage. That strategy worked in various forms for a very long time. But leverage only works as long as the other side has to respect it. And what's happened over these past several months is that the United States effectively called that bluff, not by trying to force the strait open through the middle, but by shutting down Iran's own access to it entirely. The world's shipping still moves. Oil still flows to most buyers. The only entity actually being strangled by this blockade is the regime that built its entire strategy around threatening to strangle everyone else. That's the twist sitting at the center of this whole conflict. The very choke point Iran spent 40 years positioning as its ultimate weapon has become the exact instrument being used against it. The mines meant to keep American ships away pushed commercial traffic straight into the safest zone for American enforcement. The drones meant to punish tankers keep getting shot down before they matter. The propaganda meant to show strength keeps revealing how much strain the regime is actually under. Every tool built to project power outward has, one by one, turned into evidence of how much pressure is building on the inside. And that pressure isn't abstract. It's showing up in empty government coffers. It's showing up in a navy that can no longer credibly challenge American ships at sea. It's showing up in a population growing more exhausted by the day, watching a war drag on with promises of victory that never quite arrive. Regimes don't usually collapse from a single knockout blow. They erode, slowly, from pressures like this one, compounding week after week until something finally gives. Nobody watching this conflict, whether they support America's approach or oppose it, can honestly say they know exactly how this ends. Maybe diplomacy finds its footing again, the way it briefly did back in April. Maybe the regime absorbs the pain and waits it out, betting that American patience runs out before Iranian resources do. Or maybe the internal pressure building inside Iran's own government eventually forces a decision nobody outside that country gets to see coming until it happens. What we do know is this: the Strait of Hormuz, the waterway Iran spent generations turning into its most powerful piece of leverage, is currently open to almost the entire world and closed only to the one country that built its entire strategy around controlling it. That's not a small detail. That's the story underneath every headline about strikes, tankers, and blockades. A regime that believed it held the world's oil supply hostage is now discovering that the hand actually gripping that leverage no longer belongs to it. However this chapter ends, it's going to reshape how the world thinks about naval power, economic pressure, and what it really takes to bring a determined regime to the negotiating table without a single boot ever touching the ground. If this breakdown helped you actually understand what's happening in the Gulf right now, instead of just seeing another confusing headline, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe if you want to keep getting the full picture as this story continues to develop, because there's a lot more still coming and you'll want to be here when it does.